Welcome everyone. Myself Professor Praveen Kumar Pathak. Today I am joined with Ms. Manisha Sharma. She is a speech expert. We are going to discuss another important issue which is termed as determinants and consequences of fertility transition. Now we all know that fertility is one of the important components of population in any society. And today we would like to understand what is meant by fertility transition, what factors are responsible for any society that experiences fertility transition. We will try to understand, the consequences of fertility transition in any society. So dear friends, if you look at fertility transition per se, it is basically refers to as a very gradual shift from a situation of high fertility in any society, which is characterized by minimal individual control, towards a low fertility scenario, which is entirely under the control of the women or couple in any given society. So if you see what kind of circumstances that prevails in a particular society is responsible for fertility. Now, we are talking about human fertility in this lecture, and we would like to understand various drivers of the fertility that we observe in different society. So today we are living in the time of 2023, where the global fertility is coming down. But if you go back some 70 to 80 years back, around 1950s, the global fertility levels were very different and they were quite high. So today roughly the fertility in the world is less than 2.5 children per woman in her reproductive lifetime. And if you contrast the today's situation with what we had way back in 1950s, which was roughly around 5 to 6 children per woman. So in the last 70 to 80 years, situation in the world has changed dramatically in terms of the structure of economy in different part of this world. Also in terms of advancement in the area of science, medicine, agriculture, food security, public health, and there has been secular trend in increase in education across the society and regions of this world, which has also meant that the traditional roles of men and women in the society have underwent a lot of change. And all these factors do play a very important role if we have to understand the fertility or family blending process and how it has changed over time. So in the traditional times, about 50 to 80 years ago, fertility or family planning was largely understood as blessing by God or something which is given by fate, to a situation that we are today witnessing in several parts of the world, where fertility or family planning or is a family building process by design. It's not anything mere by chance or just by fate. So this is how scientists who are working in these areas have understood that as any society undergoes fertility transition, the process of family building itself changes from something which was largely understood as mere by fate to a well-planned decision about family and family size, its composition by the family, which is couples and sometimes extended family members. So if you look at this entire process of fertility transition, it clearly involves a delay in the childbearing at the older ages, at least beyond the age of teens, and bring earlier childbearing to an end. So what happens if you compare the traditional society, even if you take case of India, in many parts of this nation, several places where rural population lives, proportion of rural population is high, where people have limited education, economic situation of population is weaker, and access to education, public health services, communication, mass media exposure, etc. is limited. In several of these places in India today, we still observe that a lot of young girls and women enter into marriage at a relatively younger ages. by virtue of which they are not able to invest significant proportion of their life into education, skill building and training. Which means that when these young girls and women enter into marriage at an early age, many times before the legal age at marriage, so soon after they are getting married, they are put under tremendous pressure to have their kids in the family in order to cement their marital union. And what is happening is, when people enter into marriage at early ages, many cases it has been observed that they tend to have children, large number of children, and the spacing between the birth happens to be very, very small. So the implication is that when you have large family size and the spacing between children to be smaller, it has detrimental impact on both the children, infants, and also the mother. So what has happened, that the body of the young women is not physically capable enough to bear regular childbearing at such a small span of time, which means that the health and nutrition and well-being of both mother and her children are put under tremendous risk. And so therefore, if you look at some of the most compelling statistics related to the levels of infant and child mortality, or if we also look at some of the startling figures related with maternal mortality in this nation, states such as the so-called empowered action group states in the part of Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Assam, many of these regions and states, we observe that the burden of childbearing and child rearing is quite higher among women who are very young. So teenage pregnancy, teenage motherhood is one of the biggest challenge that we are facing for a long period of time. Even today, this challenge is very significant. And what is happening because of teenage pregnancy and motherhood, there is a huge risk on the nutrition, health, and well-being of children and mother. And so therefore we observe the disproportionately higher incidence of both maternal and infant and child deaths in some of these regions in the country. And so with this idea in mind, it is very important for a nation and a society to plan and create congenial environment wherein we could delay early marriages, particularly among women, at least that she should be able to get secondary level education or college level education, after which if people enter into marriage and family building, that is the opportune time where the health and well-being of both mother and children could improve. So when you think about fertility transition per se, it is basically involves number of things, and one of the important facets of these fertility transition happens to be delaying the age at childbearing from relatively younger ages. People started having childbearing at age of 12, 13, 14, 15. And we have to reduce this number and make sure that, at least people marry at, the legal ages and start having children post that. So, which means that, the family situation in terms of, investing into the health and well-being of mothers would deliver dividends in the long run. Otherwise, what happens in cases where we have these incidents of child marriages and teenage pregnancies and motherhood, the family situation also deteriorates in the long run. And if number of such families are huge, it has tremendous impact on the society and nation in terms of healthcare burden, in terms of loss of wages of the family members who may not be able to join workforce, and there are many other related costs attached. So in the long run, the negative externalities linked with child marriages and teenage pregnancies are significant. And so therefore, it is very much important for nation and the state to make sure that general understanding about the opportune time of marriage and entering into childbearing is very critical. And this is very much reflected with the prevailing social, economic and cultural situation of each and every society. Now, if you look at this process of fertility transition, it basically helps women and men to avoid unwanted parenthood and help them to achieve healthy spacing between births. It allows them to achieve the desired family size, the number of children that they would like to have in their lifetime. So, if you look at the developed society or even the states which are socioeconomically advanced in India today, most of these couples have well informed about means of spacing between birth. They also have knowledge, they also have willingness. So if you have all these criteria met, knowledge, awareness, means and willingness, you can achieve the desired family size and you can achieve the planned family. So that is the whole idea of transition of family building process from a stage where family was by fate to a stage where family building is by choice and by design. Now, what is happening in cases of the traditional societies? We observe that mortality levels remain significantly higher, and so there is a huge burden of infant and child death. So if you suppose go 80 to 90 years back in the Indian context, or maybe at the time of independence, majority of families in India used to have about 6, 7 or 8 children, out of which hardly 2 or 3 were able to survive. So the difference was the number of children who could not survive. So in order to have the desired family of say 3 or 4 children in 1950s and 60s, people had to have 6 or 8 children, and because they knew that it's beyond their means and capacities and control to curtail the burden of risk of death among infants and children. But as the nation, society, medicine, agriculture, public health, general water sanitation, all these facilities improved access in the common population, it allowed the improvement in infant and child survival in a great extent. And therefore what happened was that now people generally started understanding that like 30 years down the line, from 50s to 1980s or 1990s, people gradually understood that with the improvement in the economic, social, health, agriculture, food supply situation of the society, the burden of or the risk of death among children has come down. So if you really want to have, say for example, 3 or 4 kids, now you need not produce 7 or 8 kids to have them. And this led to a very secular declining trend in the fertility levels. So if you compare the total fertility rate of women in the reproductive age in India in 60s, roughly around 5 to 6 children, it came down to around 3 to 4 children in 80s and 90s. Today's the total fertility level among women in India is roughly around 2 children per woman. So if you compare, like in the last 70 years, there has been a very drastic drop in the fertility levels. And one of the important contributing factors in this important transition has been a significant decline in the risk of infant and child death. And this has allowed couples across India and many other parts of the world to plan and have fewer, healthier children, smaller families, healthier families. And we will see in the course of this lecture and understand how these different sizes of families have implications for individuals, families and society as a whole. And which means that in order to provide healthy living, good education, good life circumstances, it is important for couples and families to plan their number of children. So the major central question of this important lecture is, if you think about fertility transition, the key questions are why, when and how does fertility declines from high to lower levels. So if you look at fertility from a demographic perspective, basically fertility is understood as actual fertility performance of the men and women. So basically it means how many children men or women have actually produced or parented. So in cases of societies where we have recorded higher fertility, most of these parents or couples or individuals have several children. So in a high fertility situation, like today, if you talk about many places in part of UP or Bihar, or if you compare with some of the countries in Africa, where number of children are still quite significant, more than 4 or 5 kids that people have, which is considered as a relatively high fertility society. If you contrast with the situation of low fertility, most of the states in India today, roughly 23 to 24 Indian states, mostly in the southern part of India, eastern part of India and some of the northern states, have achieved a below replacement fertility of 2.1, which means that most individual and parents have fewer children. So if you look at fertility, fertility is an outcome of two important components. One is of course the biological component, and the other one is the social component. If you look at the biological component of human fertility, is basically concerned with the ability of couples to produce children. So generally in demography it is understood as couples who have tried unsuccessfully for at least 12 months to conceive a child are considered as infertile, right? And in demography they are referred as infecund. So for most women, fecundity starts from the age of menarche, which is the onset of menstruation, usually in the teens, peaks in the 20s and then declines to menopause, the end of the menstruation time. If you look at some of the global data, Hutterites, which is a tribal community in the US, has been recorded with perhaps one of the highest fertility of 11 children per woman in the world. So some of the highest levels of fertility. However, if you look at the other biological elements of fertility which are probably important to understand is pregnancies are of course dangerous, so it has huge implication in terms of maternal mortality, and several developing countries are struggling to bring down the burden of maternal mortality. If you look at fecundity, it's also possible because of lack of access to good diet and care, so therefore it also results into the lower level of fertility.